Is Russia the most sanctioned country in the world?
False.
Please explain.
No, so there's always this misconception out there that Russia is the most highly sanctioned country in the world, and it's not. It is under significant global sanctions from a range of Western partners. However, it's really important to note that Iran really is the most sanctioned country in the world.
Welcome back to Guide to the Global Economy, where we break down the most pressing issues in national security, geoeconomics, and finance, and try to do it in plain English. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics at the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to be joined by Jessie Yin, Assistant Director at the Geoeconomics Center. And today we're going to dive into the Russian economy, talk about what's happened over the past 4 years, and what might happen in the year to come. We have two fantastic guests to bring in, our colleagues from the Geoeconomics Center. But before we do that, Jessie, I wanted to start with you and just break down a little, what is the state of the Russian economy? We hear a lot about it. I know data is hard to come by. What is actually going on in Russia today?
We've certainly followed the Russian economy and the state of it for quite a few years now. And at the Geoeconomics Center, we tend to say that GDP and exchange rate are not the best indicators to look at. For a number of reasons, GDP tends to be inflated by the wartime economy, and the exchange rate is disproportionately impacted by the capital controls.
So understand that GDP is not the best number, but just out of curiosity, what is Russia's GDP, at least as reported or as the IMF calculates it?
As of 2025, GDP growth was at 1%. This number, when we put it into the context of Russia's deficit, which hit an all-time high since the start of the war in 2025 at 5.6 trillion rubles, which is more than 2.6% of GDP. So when we compare that to even just the growth number that we do have, we see that Russia's sort of runway to financially conduct this war is narrowing.
So the runway is narrowing. They're driving up deficits. We know this to fund the war effort. So where are they finding the money?
They're finding it in a few places. An interesting thing is that last year was the first time that China lent money to Russia. It was a small amount, only 3 billion USD, but this shows a sort of crossing of a line of where they can potentially find other places for funding. The National Welfare Fund is coming to an end. And then just other indicators that we like to look at when we think about possible measures that Russia can take to boost up its economy. Inflation was at 6% as of the beginning of this year, which is
terrible. Not great.
Yeah. It's lower than the high that it hit last year at 10%, but interest rates are still very high.
How high?
Just in February, they cut the interest rate to 15.5%.
Oof. That's high.
Mm-hmm. So these are the indicators that we sort of look at here when we try to put in context what sanctions have done to the Russian economy, what the war effort has done. But I think probably our guests later can help put this in context even more.
Yeah, 15.5% I think gives you a sense of how sort of off-kilter the Russian economy is. I mean, that is a kind of EM situation, emerging market and crisis type interest rate that is really not something that feels stable over the long term. I know the central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, has basically deployed every tool in her toolkit over the past 4 years, but it feels like there aren't that many options left. Yeah. At least based on the standard way you think about running an economy.
Mm-hmm. And with inflation remaining high, it also limits certain measures that they can take that would be furtherly inflationary.
And then the challenge, of course, for Putin is domestic stability. With that kind of price pressure on his population for a prolonged period of time, that's where you can lose what is already tenuous support for the war effort. We always talk about the morale of the Ukrainians, how they are weathering the storm, and I don't think we spend enough attention talking about the impacts on the Russians, because ultimately that is what will support or not support the war effort for Putin.
Certainly.
So let's bring in our guest. We have with us Kim Donovan, Director of Economic Statecraft at the Atlantic Council, and Maia Nikoladze, Associate Director of Economic Statecraft. They are the authors of the Russian Sanctions Database, Global Energy Sanctions Dashboard, and more at the Atlantic Council, and thrilled to have them here with us. Kim, Maia, Welcome to Guide to the Global Economy. I want to start, Kim, and jump in. Jesse and I were talking about the state of the Russian economy as it is, but let's do a little history. How did we get here? There's a lot of talk about what was and what wasn't going to happen to the Russian economy when the war started 4 years ago. You have expertise in sanctions, a deep background in this field, and we've used these tools like never before. What's happened in the Russian economy over the past 4 years?
That's such a loaded question, Josh, but thank you so much for the opportunity to be on the show. So it's great that Maia and I have really been tracking this over the past 4 years, as you noted. And I think when we look back, it's important to remember that back in 2022, this was unprecedented of what the G7 had done by issuing coordinated sanctions, blocking Russia's sovereign reserves, instituting a price cap on its oil, as well as going after its defense industrial base with sanctions and ultimately secondary sanctions. So this unprecedented kind of economic pressure that the West really placed on Russia significantly impacted its economy as well as its ability to export its oil and just transact around the world. And it's important to remember, as we're looking back to what the purpose of this coordinated economic pressure really was. And at the time, President Biden had said that we were going to turn the ruble to rubble.
Remember that.
Right. And there were nuclear options when we were going after the sovereign assets. But really what it breaks down to is that there were three core objectives to this economic pressure approach. The first objective was to reduce Russia's revenues from its commodity exports, like oil, cripple Russia's military capability and its ability to continue to pursue the war. And then the third was to impose significant pain on Russia's economy. Now, there's definitely been mixed results, but I say overall, it's been pretty effective, just even noting kind of the points that Jesse raised at the top of where Russia's economy is really hurting.
Just to follow up on that, because I think a lot of people who don't follow this closely might have this perception that sanctions didn't work. Russian economy standing. It's interesting to hear you say, no, it actually has achieved some of the objectives. And I wonder if there's a disconnect between what most people think the objectives were to what the objectives actually could achieve.
Sure. And I think that's, some of it does come down to the messaging that went out when sanctions were first rolled out. I mean, just kind of the types of language of like turning the ruble to rubble. I mean, that sets a precedent that may not be achievable. But what has happened where Russia's, National Welfare Fund, which is like the rainy day fund, it's money they never really want to tap into. It gone from hundreds of billions of dollars to now I think the liquid assets are somewhere around like 51 billion.
Oh, it's really drained.
It's really drained. And they're going to continue to have to draw down on that throughout 2026. So they're running out of cash. The fact that, as Jesse noted too, that inflation remains pretty high, around 6%, which is not, it's horrible. It's better than the 10 that it was. For a healthy economy, it's really around like 2, is where you want to see it. And interest rates, I mean, they are, the central bank is making a lot of moves to try to reduce those. So it is down to 15.5%. But it did peak.
It's wild to hear down to 15.5.
Right? It peaked in 2024 at 21%. I mean, that's astronomical. We could never anticipate something like that in the United States and what the impact that would have. And, we're also just seeing where, taxes have increased on the Russian population. There's also massive labor shortages where, they're recruiting people from African countries to come fill their manufacturing jobs. And there's just a lot of, really big indicators that the Russian economy is not going in the right direction.
So Kim touched upon the fact that sanctions were really trying to drive down the amount of revenue that Russia could get from its commodity exports. And we're seeing some changes right now as well. Maia, what's been new over the past 6 months when it comes to Russia's energy, and why does that matter?
Yeah, past 6 months have been great in terms of reducing Russia's revenues from commodities exports. So everything Kim described in terms of what's happening to the Russian economy, big part of that was because Russia's energy revenues dropped. There was a combination of factors. Last year, Ukrainians were attacking Russia's energy infrastructure in the Black Sea. There was also drop in global oil prices. So, OPEC increased production. At the same time, China's demand dropped in 2025. So there was the combination of those factors that just led to lower global oil prices. But then something that we pay attention to at the Economic Statecraft Initiative was sanctions targeting Lukoil and Rosneft. So those were very important Russian oil companies. So after sanctions were imposed on those companies, we saw that Indian buyers have become reluctant to buy Russian oil, and as a result of that, so that happened in October, and we had a Russia sanctions database coming up just a couple of weeks later. So we were doing research. We were trying to find an indicator of how can we measure if these sanctions are effective in the short term. Down the road we would have data to look at like we do now, but back then we need some indicators, and we identified Russian oil stuck at sea as one of the indicators that would tell us of if whether sanctions were having immediate impact. So as Kim said at the beginning, there are Russian oil stuck at sea even today. Those sanctions were effective in that sense. And basically what we saw in 2025 was that Russia had 27% less revenue from energy exports compared to pre-war levels, which is pretty significant.
Yeah, I think even when we took a look at that data in February, Russian ships stuck at sea, that sort of lag time is almost 2 or 3 months longer than other exporters like Saudi Arabia. Just to follow up on what you were saying of drops in oil prices last year, we've definitely seen oil prices spike again recently because of what's happened with Iran. How do you see that impacting energy sanctions and just the space in general of does Russia now have more chances to export its oil?
Yes, so a big part of the success of sanctions on Russian companies depended on other oil exporters filling in the space that was created by sanctions. So, for example, in the Indian market, if they are not importing Russian oil, they need alternative suppliers, and Russian oil was replaced by Saudi Arabian oil. So now the Strait of Hormuz, being in the situation that it is now, this oil is stuck there and it cannot be delivered to India. So in that situation, the sanctions were sort of dependent on this available supply from Saudi Arabia and alternative suppliers to India. So if we're in a situation where those alternative supplies are not available, then India might be in a situation where they might consider importing sanctioned Russian oil.
Kim, is this a lifeline now for the Russian economy? We talked about all the pressure points on the Russian economy, but what Maia is talking about makes me think the situation in Iran is maybe changing the calculus.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And oil prices and also gold prices are two things that I'm really kind of looking out for, because we've seen where, especially over the course of the past 4 years in particular, Russia has been investing more in gold as a means to offset some of their losses in just fiat currencies and their access to transact. And so when we're looking at gold prices are now surging. I think today, as of Monday, March 2nd, gold prices peaked today at over $5,400 per troy ounce. The fact that Russia has nearly a third of its international reserve holdings set in golds, that's a pretty big spike for them. And back in January, even Bloomberg had a good article talking about how Russia gained about $216 billion just from holding gold. So that, these are things that I think will help buffer the Russian economy. So all the hits that they've taken, all of kind of our estimates that they're really going to be struggling in 2026, if oil prices surge and countries like India are going to be turning back towards kind of this sanctioned Russian oil that's at sea, on top of gold prices, surging, that can potentially translate into more money for Russia.
So we're talking gold and oil. It feels like a very 19th century type economic conversation, but I want to ask you both about a more modern type of finance, cryptocurrency, because this is a different dimension to the Russian economy. You've both written about this. We focus on this issue as a center. Did the Russians rely on crypto? Is crypto a factor for them?
Yes. It's been really interesting following the crypto story as it pertains to Russia. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, crypto was illegal in Russia. Then, we have seen this complete 180 where, the Russian government is allowing people to now have this as a form of, holding value and using it for cross-border payments. We've seen where there's been crypto platforms like A785 that is a ruble-backed stablecoin that was developed specifically for the purpose of evading sanctions. That's come online. The EU has sanctioned the coin itself, and the United States and the UK have kind of sanctioned exchanges and platforms around it. But it's really interesting to see where kind of crypto and innovation in the financial space is actually a result of attempts to evade sanctions when it comes to Russia, which I think is a very different story when you're looking at other countries.
Yeah, another sort of situation to add, based on our Russia sanctions database research, we saw that Indian and Chinese buyers of Russian oil were converting rupees and renminbi to crypto, and then that was being converted back to ruble. So essentially, in a normal world outside of, without crypto, you would have the dollar as that middle currency. So what we're seeing now is digital assets are sort of replacing the dollar as that middle currency. Which is quite concerning development.
I'm smiling this because this goes back to our conversation a few episodes ago with Dan McDowell, who's senior fellow at the Economic Statecraft Initiative. He made this point about the intermediary and blockchain and crypto serving that role. But now we see it in practice. There's conceptual of how it would work, and then this is a real live use case of that situation. So Maia, you're just talking about these networks and how countries move money through all different ways between themselves and new technology, hoping to do it. You and Kim have really coined this concept, axis of evasion, and it's beyond just crypto. It's about the concept of countries working together. Kim, what is it, and how is it playing out now in real time around the world?
Yeah, thank you for asking this, because it's something that Maia and I were starting to see a couple of years ago, and then we coined it axis of evasion because we were trying to really capture what we were seeing through our work in kind of measuring the effectiveness of Russia sanctions. We were trying to figure out how is Russia still generating revenue despite the price cap on its oil, because this was all pre oil being sanctioned. We were also trying to better understand who was enabling this, and ultimately it came down to China. And what we were seeing was very reminiscent for me on what I'd seen China doing with Iran and helping Iran evade sanctions by continuing to import their oil. So we had a situation where China was continuing to import Russian oil as well as sanctioned Iranian oil, despite all these Western attempts to restrict it. So then we started to dig in deeper, and we need to figure out, well, how are they actually doing this? Because it's one thing to be able to buy it, but we needed to figure out, what are the transactions taking place? So that's where we really started to kind of learn more about the alternative payment systems that were being used. So crypto being one of the key means, as well as things like barter trade. There's situations where, Iran was paying China for pistachios.
This is really back to basics.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know that there was such a huge pistachio market in China, but they were giving them pistachios in exchange for technology and different components that had been controlled through export controls. And just we were kept seeing where there were all of these different unique transaction methods that were kind of popping up. And so this is where we again, coming up with axis of evasion, we were looking at how China is really the axis by which all these different countries were evading these Western sanctions. So, Venezuela is part of this, as well as North Korea. And what's interesting is that they're all sharing different tactics and techniques. So whether it is kind of different things on the alternative payment system and how different digital assets are being used, or things like the shadow fleet that are really being leveraged in order to continue the flow of this now sanctioned oil.
Yeah, just to pick up on the shadow fleet point, I think it's come up in the news a bit recently. Maia, what exactly is the shadow fleet and how does it work?
So shadow fleet started as a sanctions evasion problem, but more recently it has become a broader security threat and an environmental hazard. So shadow fleet tankers, as Kim said, is one of the elements of the axis of evasion network, something that allows Russia, Iran, and before Venezuela to export the sanctioned oil to China. So the way it works, these are very old tankers, 20 to 30 years old. At that point, tankers should no longer be operating. They don't report accurate location. They have very complex ownership, and they are most of the time registered in so-called flags of convenience states. So essentially, if you are in a situation where there is a collision of a shadow fleet tanker near your coast, and that's followed by an oil spill because they carry sanctioned oil, and you are a country, a coastal state, you're essentially in a situation where nobody's taking responsibility. They don't have insurance. Nobody's going to pay you. So they are a big problem for coastal states and just for everyone really in the world. So that's what the shadow fleet is. Unfortunately, that problem has really expanded. So it started as an Iran problem. North Korea has used it, Venezuela, but it became really global once Russia entered the game. And what we are seeing most recently is a lot of seizures of shadow fleet tankers. And I think now these shadow fleet tankers are responding to that by reflagging to Russia, which is supposed to protect them following the international maritime law. So we will see how it goes, but we're just seeing this trend of increased militarization of the shadow fleet issue, NATO getting involved, and just we are doing research and analysis, hoping that we can address this with economic tools rather than let it escalate to a military issue.
And Maia, just to follow up there on the shadow fleet, as the situation unfolds in Iran, and then I would imagine we'll see how things develop, but then there's going to be questions about transit and which ships transit or not. Is there going to be more reliance, do you think, on the shadow fleet?
I think there will be increased vigilance on the Western side. I do think that if we're in a situation where Russian oil ends up replacing Iranian oil in the Chinese market and India starts importing that oil, then shadow fleet, enforcing sanctions against the shadow fleet will become a primary tool through which we can stop or, reduce Russia's revenues from oil exports.
So, Kim, let me play sanctions critic for a moment based on what Maia is saying about the shadow fleet. There's this rise, it existed, but this great proliferation of shadow fleet, with Russia moving oil all over the world. Wasn't the price cap supposed to address this? We were going to have a price cap. This was going to set some kind of floor here, and that was going to create a situation that was going to limit Russian revenue. Did something go wrong?
Yeah, we couldn't enforce it. I think that, it's an example of there's novel and unique ideas and tools that are constantly being created in order to address, the conflicts of the day. And so the price cap at the time that it was established back in 2022, and it was at $60 a barrel. So the whole concept was that we wanted to reduce Russia's revenue, but we couldn't completely cut it off, like Russian oil off, because Europe really needed it. Europe was the major importer of Russian oil. Now, over the past 4 years, really big kudos to Europe. They have drawn down significantly on their demand and need for Russian oil, and they found alternative sources. But this price cap thing is still floating out there. The EU has reduced the cap, I think, to $47. I think even Australia has gone down to $40 or something. But that's all, depends on the insurance companies to be able to enforce that cap somehow. So the whole concept was that in order for insurance companies to continue to insure your vessels, you have to guarantee that you're not selling this oil above the price cap. Again, that creates just a lot of uncertainty of who's supposed to be enforcing this and which organizations, which countries are responsible. So you have this price cap thing that's out there and that has set a floor, but it's also, it's not even that low of a floor because Russia is still able to generate some revenue from it. But as a direct result of that, and then also as a direct result of the, once oil especially was by the United States sanctioned, like Rosneft and Lukoil and a couple of the other two major oil majors, that, really did kind of necessitate the need for the shadow fleet to continue. And now, what Maia and I are continuing to do research on is that there's now this huge issue that is a direct result of sanctions, whether from Iran or on Russia. And the shadow fleet, the last numbers that we had from a couple months ago was that there's over 3,200 shadow fleet vessels on the water.
Massive.
Which is, represents 17% of the oil tankers out there. And as Maia mentioned, this is an environmental hazard because these are uninsured, old, clunky ships that shouldn't be, they're not seaworthy. They're also crewed by, untrained crews and, not the best captains probably. And then on top of that, you have a national security issue because whether it's intentional or not, some of them are dragging their anchors and they're pulling up undersea cables. So this is a massive issue that is, again, direct result of sanctions from Russia as well as Iran. And it's something that I think the global community is going to have to figure out how we can address this together.
Okay, so I have two more questions in the limited time we have left. The first is a true or false, and I think it's a favorite of the Economic Statecraft Initiative. Is Russia the most sanctioned country in the world?
False.
Please explain.
No, so there's always this misconception out there that Russia is the most highly sanctioned country in the world, and it's not. It is under significant global sanctions from a range of Western partners. However, it's really important to note that Iran really is the most sanctioned country in the world. And that's because it has UN sanctions on it. It has US, EU, UK. But then it also has some different unique economic pressure points, especially the fact that its entire oil sector is sanctioned. With Russia, it's just a handful of companies. Well, very significant and important. It's the oil itself is not sanctioned. Iran's entire oil infrastructure, including petrochemicals, is all under U.S. sanctions. And they all carry secondary sanctions. And the other really unique authority as it relates to Iran is that it has a FinCEN Section 311 of the U.S. Patriot Act.
Which means...
It's FinCEN a couple of years ago identified the entire jurisdiction of Iran as a primary money laundering concern, pursuant to their authorities of Section 311 of the U.S. Patriot Act. So that means that no Western bank in their right mind would try to connect and provide correspondent banking services with an Iranian bank or any financial institution operating within the jurisdiction of Iran. So these are kind of important points because whatever happens next with the situation in the Middle East, these are the types of considerations that are going to need to be thought through and how are we going to either readdress or kind of double down on some of the different efforts we've done.
So, Kim, my final question before I'll turn to Jessie to wrap us up, and it's a fact check question. You helped very clearly explain why Russia is not the most sanctioned country in the world, and Iran is. We were also told that Russian banks were taken off the SWIFT network, that they were de-SWIFted. True? False?
A and B.
Okay.
So, that was supposed to be the nuclear option back in 2022. And, there was a lot discussed on de-SWIFting Russia and what that would mean. We actually, a couple of years ago, did do a lot of research trying to figure out what did de-SWIFting mean. And what, unfortunately, we found was that 10 banks were actually taken off.
Surprising.
And then what we further learned as part of this process is that because SWIFT is headquartered in the EU, it complies with EU law and sanctions. So SWIFT took off of their network the banks that the EU had sanctioned. And there's been a couple more since then. I don't know the total number right now, but it's definitely not all Russian banks. There's like 130 Russian banks that are still somewhat, active and moving money. But that's where, it's also been interesting where Russia has, again, on the financial innovation point, where their innovation has been in support of sanctions evasion, whether on the crypto side or developing their own SWIFT-like system like SPFS, which has subsequently been sanctioned. They are making moves in the innovation space in order to evade sanctions. So not only is it a wartime economy, but it's got a sanctions evasion economy going on.
I think it's just such an important point that sanctions are iterative. You sanction, countries find workarounds, policymakers adapt. This is the game that is being played here, and it doesn't end in one round.
Not at all.
All right, so we've covered a lot on Russia's economy 4 years down the line, from existing sanctions, how we got here, all of the new factors that we're facing now. What do the two of y'all think is next for the year ahead? What are you looking for, and what is still needed to keep the pressure on?
I'm definitely looking at both India and China, right? Because those have been the top two destinations for Russian oil. And there are just so many factors at play that impact India's appetite for importing Russian oil. We were just talking earlier that it has become too complicated because now in this sanctions issue, you also have trade negotiations involved. On the other side, then you got Russia negotiations involved, and then now all of a sudden you have the Middle East involved in all of this. So it just has become too difficult, and in order for this to work out and to have India import Saudi Arabian oil instead of the Russian one, a lot of things need to be fixed quite soon. I think it has been reported that if there is closure or a shutdown in the Strait of Hormuz for about 2 to 3 weeks, crude oil prices would go up to $100, and that would be very good news for Russia. So kind of dialing down that crisis in the Middle East will be very important. And then on the Chinese side, Chinese state-owned oil company did stop importing Russian oil in response to the October sanctions, but the teapots keep importing still. So I think China will continue to do business as usual, and in that context, then enforcement of sanctions against the shadow fleet has to be the solution.
And I would just pile on that, as Maia noted, I think one of the things I'm really looking out for is that Russia really stands to benefit from the conflict in the Middle East. And if that is a prolonged conflict, then they will benefit even more. So right now is really a time where I think Western partners are going to have to work more closely together to enforce existing sanctions. And I think the United States should strongly consider aligning their sanctions with those of the UK and the EU right now, especially, as we know with the shadow fleet, the EU's designated hundreds of more vessels than the United States have. And I think that some easy wins would be for the U.S. to at least follow suit and join our partners on that. And then I think it's also going to be very interesting to see, as Maia noted too, where trade negotiations are now kind of part of this mix of issues, and where we have seen the Trump administration use the threat of tariffs, and specifically IEEPA tariffs, to pressure countries like India to reduce the amount of Russian oil they were importing. Well, now with the Supreme Court ruling, that's no longer a tool they can use. So I'm also looking out for opportunities where the administration is going to kind of turn back to sanctions in order to create that pressure and leverage to get some other countries to ultimately, do what we would like them to do as it relates to not importing Russian oil, and also trying to get the Russians to seriously negotiate an end to this war.
Well, Kim, Maia, thank you so much for joining us. And if the next year is going to be about the re-rise of sanctions, there's no two people better to track it than both of you. So thank you both for your incredible work. And we look forward to having you back on The Guide. And thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of Guide to the Global Economy. You can listen wherever you get your podcast.